Yes, so I just posted in the chat in case you're wondering what will be in this track, the 3 papers we will have here. So as we're waiting, we have yet another 13 minutes before this starts. I'd like to invite the presenters to try out sharing the screen and starting your video, just to be a step ahead. So maybe Dave, do you want to start and try to just share your screen? And then I think there's an instruction that got to you by email that you need to stop annotations on top of your video, because we have trolls, so oddly enough, that think it's interesting to enter into our talks and do annotations on top of the videos. Out of all the things that people amuse themselves with, right? Well, anyway, so once you start sharing, there will be this option that you can turn off annotations, and I think you've got an email with that instruction.
Yeah, the instruction is also now in the chat window here. Azra just pasted it in.
Hi, Ari, do you want to restart this room and see if we can get a new address for it?
No, very long.
I think right now wouldn't do that. We have the waiting room and things seem to be running, so I think the safest is we keep going.
Okay.
Thanks.
So who is in the waiting room right now, Ari?
So there's only a couple of people who haven't provided their full names yet, and Azra is handling that. So
okay.
Don't worry about that, Kia. Seems like we have all the presenters on the call already.
Lovely. So Dave, how are you doing with trying to share your video? I can't hear you. You're muted. I can unmute you. Here we go. Now you can talk. No?
Yes.
There you are.
I see this dialog box, host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I'm not allowed to share my screen yet.
Okay, so then we'll check in with Irie. She is the one with the power in this track. So she will give you some power and let you try your video. Yeah. So
yes,
now.
Yeah, that should have done it. Sorry for that.
Oh, that looks lovely. Okay, so you can start your video and then turn it off again.
Okay, brilliant. I shall do that.
Just so that we see that something is moving.
Hi, my name is Debargha. Okay, so for the day. And
Lovely. Okay, looks great. Thank you.
Sure.
So then you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
And we will ask Maria, Kjærup.
Sorry, Kia, I don't think the audio was right on that presentation. I think it was just playing through the microphone.
Okay, so let's try again. Dave, do you want to put it up
I will
again?
share my screen again, yes.
And then make sure you click on the audio option. Make sure it's on at the bottom when it asks you.
Share computer sound. Is that the one? Yes.
Yeah,
share.
that's correct.
I will try to play. Presenting today is about design choices for communication. Okay, brilliant.
Amazing. Thank you, Dave. So now we move to Maria, Kjærup. Do you want to share your screen?
And remember to do the turning off the annotations thing as well.
Yeah. Did you find that, Maria, the turning off annotations? Do you want me to unmute you, perhaps? Unmute. There you go.
I found the annotation, but how do you turn it off?
So the instruction is, I'll read the instruction to you.
I think disable attendee annotation, right?
Yeah,
Yep, that's correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
See.
So let's hear the video. If you start the video, just to make sure that we can hear you.
Oop. Perhaps I can.
Hi, my name is Maria, and I would like to present our paper titled Digital Enabled.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't think you clicked on the audio option because it was coming through the microphone, not from the system.
Oh. Yeah.
So yeah, when you do the share screen, so close the share screen, start again, and then make sure you do the option to share the computer audio.
Yes.
So that's an option that comes visible when you're choosing your screen at the very bottom of that.
I'm right now in the.
Stop sharing, Maria. Stop sharing your screen first.
Yes, I'm trying to find out. How.
Top of the window. Top of the window is a little green button that says
Stop share.
yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And now do it again. Share your screen again, and then look for, as you're about to start, share your computer.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, let's try it. Let's try
it. All right.
And now.
A study of passenger trips in rural, low-density populated areas of Denmark.
Is it still the mic?
Together with Mikael Skov and Niels Agerholm from Aalborg University.
So I wouldn't be able to tell. Barry, was that still the?
It did. We could hear you, so it wasn't such a big problem. I could understand what you were saying, but it did sound like it wasn't on.
Do you want to try again? Do you want to? Do we still?
I think I have to close it down. Because
if you might have to restart Zoom, that's what it probably asked you to do.
Yeah. Okay, so you do that, and meanwhile, we're going to let Barry try his presentation. Okay. There you go, Barry.
So I'll share my screen. I will remember to do this here. Oh, I've got the same problem.
Oops.
So I have to. Oh no.
Okay, we'll try it and we'll.
Let's see. Okay, and I'm gonna try actually. Does that work okay?
Oh, yes, just a sec.
And then I have to turn the annotation off, don't I? Okay, I can't see my mouse.
So you're going to talk to your slides? You don't have a pre-recorded?
Yes, I'm going to give the presentation like this.
Okay. So then it works with the sound.
Yeah. Right. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so, oh, Maria, lovely. You've restarted. Let's see if you can get the sound go. I think you need to click on the video again. No, now we can't hear anything.
Maybe you got to turn the mute off.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, there we go. Try again. No.
I can't even hear it myself now.
Maybe if you leave Zoom and then start again, leave Zoom entirely and then re-enter.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are here waiting for the session to start, we still have 4 minutes. So I don't know what you're doing here already. But as soon as we do start, we're going to have 3 amazing papers on mobility of different kinds. So we're very much looking forward to that. Right now, we're just testing technology and trying to figure out what the trolls are doing. Oddly enough, we have trolls who try to enter into this, this joint presentations. I don't know why they want to be here, but they are. So if you happen to be not a troll and you feel like I need to come in, then it's actually Irie who decides who is a troll and who isn't. And so I think Maria is back. Maria, so let's see. Are you muted? No, you're not.
Ooh.
So you can now try your video again, and let's see
Again.
if the sound is working this time.
Yes, I hope. That I wrote together with Mikael Skov and Niels Agerholm.
That was amazing.
Hi, my name is Marieke, and I would like.
So now you can stop sharing your screen, and then when you start sharing again, remember to turn off the possibility to annotate.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we're going to mute Maria. Oops, sorry, and wait for yet another 2 minutes before we start this session. And I've posted the talks that will be in this session in the chat in case you want to have a look.
Marieke, can you ask Barry to pop over to track 1 quickly if you are online? There's a request from the person sharing over there. Oh, and now Barry, and now you're back as well, Barry. So Mai is hoping for you to pop over to track 1 for some questions. So if you can check in with her on Slack or see what needs to be done, that would be great.
Yeah, so as we're waiting, I might as well tell you how interesting it is that the first thing that happens is that we get all these trolls who want to be in this session making annotations and weird stuff. And then also same thing on the YouTube channel, that it was hijacked and yeah, weird stuff happened. So that's we learn on the job, don't we? You know, this time and age, it's a crash course in being digital and online for all of us, and that's interesting. At least it's making us learn a lot of stuff very quickly, and that's not so bad. Okay, so I think it might actually be time to start. So I can see Irie is still working on trying to figure out who in the waiting room is a troll and who isn't. But anyway, I'd like to welcome you all to this session on mobility. And we're super lucky that we have a best paper as our first paper. And I wish you could be here, Dave, so we could hand over that diploma that you always get at Kai. But you'll have to have, you know, a virtual diploma for now. So Dave Day is going to make this presentation on color and animation preferences for a light band eHMI in interactions between automated vehicles and pedestrians, a crowdsourcing study. So by that, please start your screen sharing, turn off the annotations, and off we go.
Okay, thank you, Kristina. So I have recorded a video, so I will just play that. Share screen. And I'm turning off annotations. Yes. Okay. Hi, my name is Debargha Day, and the paper that I will be presenting today is about design choices for communication interfaces that allow self-driving cars to interact with pedestrians. As automated driving technology progresses, the control of the vehicle no longer lies with the human driver. In this context, it is no longer possible for a road user, pedestrian, to look inside the car for confirmatory cues such as gestures or eye contact, as they would normally do with the driver of an ordinary car. In order to bridge this communication gap, a typically proposed solution is some sort of an external human-machine interface, or eHMI. eHMIs can relay information about the automated vehicle's intentions in traffic. Among the various eHMI concepts, the light band is a rather popular choice. By light band, I mean a strip of light that is attached to the front of a car, either on the bumper or the windshield. In this slide, you see several examples from recent work of automated vehicle eHMI concepts that have used light band eHMI. However, the existing concepts differ in their own visions. Their colors vary from yellow, green, magenta, white, and cyan, while they activate with different animations, ranging from filling up sideways to blinking and pulsating. We currently do not have consensus regarding which design choices should be made. In order to avoid ambiguity, we need a systematic approach towards standardization of colors and animations, particularly from a user-centered design perspective. So why do colors and animations matter? Currently, lights of different colors with different animations are used diversely to communicate in traffic situations. The red, amber, and green lights are standard for traffic lights all over the world. The use of blue lights is common in emergency vehicles. Red lights are used for brakes. Turn indicators can be red or amber, depending on where you are. In the context of right-of-way negotiation, red is commonly understood to indicate stop, and green is associated with the message of go. The use of lights of certain colors are prohibited from implementation in the front of a vehicle for regulatory reasons. The research community in general has started to gravitate towards turquoise or cyan or a shade of blue-green as a color of choice for eHMI, but we do not yet know how pedestrians react to it. Speaking of animations, different kinds of animations can be seen in lights in traffic. Emergency vehicles commonly use flashing or rotating lights. Turn signals of cars blink or even animate sideways in some newer cars. Drivers are often known to flash their headlights to communicate with other road users. These practices are learned, and the ways lights are used in communication clearly have a social aspect to them. So it is an interesting question, what makes sense for an automated vehicle to communicate that it is yielding to another road user, particularly a pedestrian? So in this study, we explored which kind of color or animation on a light band eHMI makes the most sense from a user-centered design perspective. So we conducted a survey study to investigate this. The study was conducted with 400 participants. We hosted the survey on the Survey Gizmo tool and distributed it over Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform. We tested different colors and animation patterns, as well as the way the car communicated its yielding message, which I will show in a moment. We showed the stimuli to the participants and asked them to rate the intuitiveness of each stimulus on a 5-point Likert scale. At the end of the study, we also asked them to write a few words on their own subjective perception of what they found intuitive or unintuitive about a certain stimulus. So in the experiment, we had 3 independent variables. The first variable was the nature of the yielding message. A yielding automated vehicle may negotiate its intention with pedestrians in one of 2 ways. First, by announcing its own intention or action, such as by saying, "I'm yielding." Or second, by instructing or advising an action to the pedestrians, for instance, by saying, "Please cross." The research community is fairly united in the recommendation that an automated vehicle should not issue an advice or an instruction to others in traffic. But we do not know whether there are subtle differences between how an advice or a simple intention announcement is perceived by pedestrians. So although the message for both ways of communication are the same in principle, we still wanted to investigate if a certain color or animation makes more intuitive sense for a certain flavor of communication. The second independent variable was the color of the light band eHMI. We evaluated 3 colors, green, cyan, and red. Cyan because we wanted to evaluate its efficacy in this context, particularly because it is trending as the color of choice for eHMIs in the research community. The green and the red colors were chosen because they are typically understood as colors for stop and go in traffic context. Although red and green are prohibited by law from being used in the front of a vehicle, we wanted to see if the association of stop and go with red and green stays valid from the context of a moving vehicle as opposed to a static infrastructure, and also where cyan fit in relation between the 2. Finally, we had 5 different animation patterns. 2 of them were uniform patterns, by which I mean the entirety of the light band lit up together, which you see on the top row. We contrasted these with these uniform patterns with 3 sweeping patterns, which are shown in the bottom row. We showed each of the stimuli to the participants as you see here. The front view and the front 3/4 view of the car were shown side by side. We wanted to give the participants an unobstructed view of the entire eHMI, hence the front view, and we also wanted to present them with the perspective of what they would actually see as a pedestrian waiting to cross the road at the pavement. So, on to the results. This graph gives an overview of how the different colors and animations played into the sense of intuitiveness for a yielding message from the car to the participants. On the y-axis, the score of 1 maps to a completely unintuitive nature of a stimulus, and 5 maps to completely intuitive. And on the x-axis, we have the 5 different animation patterns we tested. We see that across the board, the green eHMI color scored as a pretty intuitive choice, while the red scored as a rather unintuitive choice for an eHMI when the car is trying to say that it's yielding. Cyan sat squarely between the two throughout. So clearly, the eHMI color had a significant effect in driving the intuitiveness of a yielding message to a pedestrian. When we looked at the interaction between the eHMI color and the nature of the message, we found that this interaction was statistically significant as well. The intuitiveness score for green in instruction condition was higher than in the intention condition. Correspondingly, the intuitiveness score of the red color was lower in the instruction condition compared to the intention condition. This indicates that the suggestive power of these two colors, green as an invitation to cross and red as a warning to not cross, are rather strong. While participants generally ascribe the same meaning in principle to each color in both the conditions, it shows that red and green also have a tendency to be associated more strongly with an instruction from the vehicle as opposed to a simple announcement of its intention. The main effect of animation was also statistically significant in both message conditions. The 2 uniform animation patterns, flash and pulse, scored better than the sweeping animation patterns. When we looked at the interaction between the animation and the message, we didn't find a significant difference, however. When we looked at the subjective feedback that the participants left while determining intuitiveness, we found some interesting insights. Firstly, an overwhelming majority of the participants commented that the colors green and red led them to make instinctive associations with go and stop, respectively. However, several participants remarked that for commonly used traffic light colors to be applied to a moving vehicle, they wouldn't know whether the notion of stopping or going would apply to the vehicle or to them as the pedestrian. This can lead to a fatal misunderstanding. Secondly, most participants showed some form of a strong bias towards red and green as colors, either from the perspective of the pedestrian or the car. However, cyan did not have a specific preference. Some participants noted that cyan can work to show yielding intention as a neutral color. Others remarked that in the absence of cyan in current traffic, they would not know yet what significance to attach to it. Thirdly, most participants noted that the color of the eHMI made a more significant conscious impact on their decision-making compared to the animation patterns. And lastly, among the participants for whom animation patterns did have an effect, several commented that uniformly changing patterns, such as flash or pulse, were preferable over the moving or sweeping patterns. The original idea behind exploring the sweeping animation patterns was that the sweeping motion could abstractly relate to a sweeping hand gesture from a driver, which would equate to an invitation to cross. However, with a few exceptions, this was not at all how the participants perceived it. So our results suggest that while red and green have immediate associations with stop and go, the meaning of these messages is not always clear and may lead to confusion. Cyan, on the other hand, is largely considered a neutral color and may thus be more suitable for communicating a yielding message. Yet another conclusion is that animation patterns do not have as much impact as colors in this communication, although uniform animation patterns may be more favorable than laterally sweeping ones. Given the fact that the role of color and animation for the design of eHMI is currently rather unexplored, we hope that our empirical insights may be helpful in the development and standardization of eHMI design for automated vehicles. I'll close by saying that I'm very sad to not be able to talk about this paper with you all at Kjærup in person this year. As a substitute, I would love to invite you to reach out to me or any of my co-authors. We would love to hear from you and continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Applause. Thank you. That was a lovely video. Now for everyone in the room, changing to gallery view is a good thing because then you see more of the participants. So for those of you who would like to ask a question, you can either raise a hand or you can put a message in the channel so that I can give you the word. So questions? So while we're waiting for people to wake up, and also turn on your videos, everyone. You're not that secretive, are you? So something that every Swedish person will ask is, of course, what about snow? What about all of the other conditions that we suffer through, darkness and daylight throughout the night and whatnot? Do you think this will work no matter what?
Well, that's a very good question. So firstly, of course, that's a question of the intensity of the light itself and how the light projects and how the perceptual salience of an eHMI, of an interface, can affect the perception of the pedestrians themselves. So indeed, there have been a lot of work in the past that compared the optical elements, the more from the perspective of optics, of human perception of colors and intensity of light, which kind of colors make sense. However, in this particular work, we decided to focus more on the human-centered design from the human factors perception from the inherent associations of colors in a traffic context. So indeed, more research needs to be done to answer that specific question.
Okay, so we have a question from Barry. I'll unmute you. Maybe you can unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, and congratulations on your best paper award as well. That's really great. I remember when I first drove in the US, I came across this sign that said X-ing, which is and I think, I mean, most of us will have experienced this. Is like, and I think for a year I never worked out what it meant, and of course. Crossing. Yeah. So I think that a lot of the time words are like augmented with colors. And I was wondering if you had any kind of insights into that kind of relationship there, that does the color take primacy? So if you have like go and it's in red, does that take primacy over the word, or?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, I would start by saying that there have been a lot of research in the area of whether text or instructions or messages in form of text makes sense. And there has been some insights that indeed text is very easy for people who actually understand the language. Text is very unambiguous. People immediately know what the car means. However, there are some inherent disadvantages to text. The primary reason being occlusion. So let's say that the car says something like stopping, but if the stop part is missing and you just only is occluded and you just see only the ing, you don't know what kind of ing it is, what the car is actually doing, or the other way around as well. If the ing is missing, the car says that it is stopping, but you only see stop, so you think it's asking you to stop. So these kinds of that's one of the major disadvantages with text, and also there is culture and language dependence. So in general, text is something that, as a whole in the research community, we are gravitating away from. However, like theoretical research has suggested that text is very easy to understand for people who do understand what it's actually saying. It's an interesting question, however, to see whether the message of the text, if it is contrasted and contradicted with the color of the associated message, if it says stop in green and go in red, what that means. So that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. Would be interesting to study, of course. But generally in the community, we are moving towards a more abstract form of communication rather than more specific instruction-based communication in this area.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Let's start with Sylvaine.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Great. I had a question about the methods. Sorry if I missed it, if you said it, but if you didn't, so that's my question. So did you do that whole research through questionnaires? You mentioned mechanical Turk and the kind of population that you asked to. So I was wondering, did you only ask questions to people? In which case I would ask, is it really about, are you talking about people's representations of how they perceive colors and signs and stuff? Or how do you tie that with actual practices would be my question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Indeed, the very nature of the fact that this was a crowdsourced study conducted over mechanical Turk was one of the things that we also noted as a limitation in our paper. So it's very different from a lab study. So we could not, we took precautions to actually test or have some manipulation checks to see if people actually understood our questions in the first place, or even how do we determine whether their color perception was actually, or if whether a colorblind person had taken the survey and we don't know whether they actually were able to distinguish between red or green or some other thing. So we did have some manipulation checks in the end, and that was the best we could do without getting into medical details. So we didn't want to get into that area. And so, yeah, indeed. So we, we conducted the study through the crowdsourced Mechanical Turk platform, as I mentioned. And then one of the other things that I didn't elaborate in the slide was that we had to limit this demographic, the participant base, to US participants only, because as many of you know, I'm sure that the worker base of MTurk is highly skewed towards American and Indian individuals. And if a task is left unrestricted, it's usually picked up by a vast majority of people from these countries. And since the traffic culture of these countries are very different, we wanted to avoid a confounding factor, and we wanted to, so it probably would have been more more comparable if we could have equal proportion of American and European workers, if you will. But in the spirit of saving time and resources, we just focused on one group of participants, which were the US participants, and we used different kinds of manipulation checks to kind of, within our abilities, refine our participant base. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So unfortunately, we do not have any more time. Sorry, Azra, you wanted to comment on the method. I also wanted to ask about the theory that you mentioned, and to me it was confusing. I thought that the gestures that you showed would make sense to people, and they didn't. So that was super interesting. But I think we'll have to save our questions for later because we need to move on to the next speaker. So for those who joined really recently, it is a really good idea to turn on your video so that the poor speaker can see you guys. Because yeah, and we're going to move on to the second talk in this session. So maybe we should start by applause. Sorry. Thank you so much, Dave. And now we move on to the second paper by Marieke Kjærup, Digital Enabled Last Mile, a study of passenger trips in rural, low-density populated areas of Denmark. So there we go. Varsågod, Maria.
Thank you very much. And I have also pre-recorded my presentation, and I will attempt to share my screen.
And don't forget to prohibit those
the annotations.
Yeah.
Yes. To present our paper titled Digital Enabled from. Hi, my name is Maria, and I would like to present our paper titled Digital Enabled Last Mile, a study of passenger trips in rural low-density populated areas of Denmark, that I wrote together with Mikael Skov and Niels Agerholm from Aalborg University. First, I want to talk about rural public transportation of Denmark. As rural areas of Denmark are characterized by a low and decreasing population density that impacts the passenger pool available and the demand for transportation services. This leaves rural areas underserviced, or even in some cases without public transportation services. And this leads to gaps in the transportation services, introducing first and last mile problems. I want to present Plustur, which is introduced as a last mile transportation service in northern Jutland in 2018. Plustur is a digital and on-demand public transportation service. It aims to connect rural areas with major transportation hubs ad hoc, where no routes are established or where routes are infrequently serviced. It must have one point of connection with traditional timetable transportation. As you can see from this figure, where the dashed line is a Plustur, and it connects with a time travel public transportation, for example, a bus or a train. It is only available when booked 2 hours in advance. That's why we call it digital enabled, and it operates at a fixed price and not person or per kilometer pricing. So we chose to study this Plustur because it is the first solidly digital public transportation service in Denmark. It enables people to plan, book, and carry out trips using mobile technologies. So we want to explore how this changes trips and how people perceive rural mobility. So we collected data from a variety of methods. We had 11 interviews with people residing or traveling in rural areas. We also had 3 interviews with the Plustur drivers. And we additionally had 3 shared Plustur rides with the recruited passengers. We also held a workshop with local public transport authority. And I want to present what we found out. First, we saw that it was quite important to integrate transparency in trip dynamics, because Plustur has these points of connection, and that can be challenging if you experience, for example, delays. It will introduce a lot of dynamics into the trip planning. However, we saw that passengers were presented with a static travel document, not taking into account these dynamics. So we want to urge to use more real-time data to communicate this dynamic to passengers. We found that a theme that came up a lot was autonomy of mobility, because car ownership and dependence on car ownership was quite high in rural areas. The car gave a flexibility and spontaneity in trip planning that public transportation couldn't provide. In particular, we saw the need for children and young people to have to negotiate lifts with their parents or their siblings, and how this had an adverse effects on after-school activities, like attending them, and also socializing with their peers. We also looked at fundamental changes of digital-enabled mobility that came up in the study. As participants expressed, it was more Plustur services was more laborious than a traditional public transportation service, because you had to plan ahead instead of deciding last minute to go to just jump on a bus or train. And there was also a force of habit of mobility patterns and preferences. We also saw that drivers had a general negative attitude towards their roles and their benefits in being in this mobility as a service. But they saw that it had value, in particular for they expressed for elderly people in rural areas. The ride-sharing element of Plustur introduced detours to individual routes, but it was not necessarily experienced as a challenge. as also this space within the vehicle afforded conversations with drivers and other passengers that were not typical of a bus or trains. So along this study, we also had some reflections, particularly on studying mobility in situ. As recruitment presented as quite a challenge for us, it was challenging identifying participants. It was difficult identifying Plustur passengers from regular public transportation passengers. And because of GDPR, we did not have a lot of passenger or use data available for recruitment. Also going into this real wild and sometimes messy world presented as being quite a vulnerable position for researchers. I'm going to show a picture here on the next slide that is a Plustur that I was involved in that didn't go quite as planned. And a lot of things are out of control when you get into the real world. So in conclusion, we saw that Plustur as an on-demand service had a potential to address first the last mile problems in rural areas, but it lacked in the degree of flexibility. Also, there was a need for integration of modes of transportation and a greater transparency in the sometimes very dynamic travel planning. There was also a need to consider several stakeholder perspectives for introducing these mobility as a service initiatives. And finally, we contribute with an empirical understanding of digital-enabled passenger trips in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. For people with questions, please put your name or the whole question into the chat, and we will unmute you so you can ask it. While we're waiting for people to do that, I just wanted to ask you a first question. So you said that you were put into a vulnerable position, and it really did look like a vulnerable position. But apart from the danger of being on the road and so on, do you really think that we should avoid these kinds of studies because they're in the wild and they're making us vulnerable? Or did you just mean to be prepared for it? Or what was your advice on how to handle that?
Yes, I definitely don't think we should avoid going into the real world to study things where they are happening with the people that are engaging in the activities. But of course, being aware that it can be a vulnerable position to put yourself in as a researcher. And because you purposely let go of some of the control that you can experience in a setting like a laboratory. And of course, it has a great value to watch things unfold naturally, but it also can be I also sometimes ended up getting a little stranded in some places, riding buses, and that was a minor issue, but you're really out there and you're feeling it and you're experiencing it, and that has value, but can be difficult to maneuver in.
So what is the value, do you think? Why would you still advise for doing it rather than doing what Dave said in his talk, is the one before you, where he was doing this using mechanical Turk and so thereby distancing himself from the road situation? So do you think that there are lessons learned that you gained that you couldn't have gained otherwise?
Definitely, because of the shared rides I took with passengers, gave a lot of new inputs especially about dynamics while we were on the road that happened in this instance, and they could remember it and talk about it as they were happening. And I see this as a great value. Instead of sometimes when you go into an interview and you have to talk about a trip you made a month ago, it can be quite difficult to remember and to recall all of the details as they were happening.
So do you think, could you point to one of your results and sort of say, I wouldn't have been able to get this result if I hadn't been out there in that vulnerable position and seeing events as they unfolded?
Yes, in particular, on one of the rides, this making this connection between a public transportation, a bus, and a Plustur, where the passenger could not identify the Plustur vehicle, was quite interesting to experience, because it was just this vehicle holding, waiting, and this passenger just waiting, looking everywhere else, and just to experience this live.
Okay, so are there other questions from the audience, dear friends? Nobody's put any questions into the chat, so then I think we will take a few minutes break. We will thank Maria first, of course, but then we will take a break until 22, so that we're following the schedule of everyone. So thank you so much, Maria. So it is time. So the next paper is by Barry Brown and Sylvaine, and both are here. It's e-scooters on the ground, lessons for redesigning urban micro-mobility. So from macro to micro. Barry.
Yeah. I guess we've all had that feeling of having to be in 3 places at the same time. This is the first time in my life I've had to virtually be in 3 places at the same time. I've actually had multiple computers I've got arranged on my desk here. So, but you've got me here now for this talk. So I think what's really lovely about this session is it brings out these changes that are happening around transport. Well, you might not be surprised by that. Actually, transport is actually very staid and very kind of infrastructure-based business. And so change doesn't come quickly, and actually new types of transport don't come along very frequently. And I think we've got 3 papers in this session that are all about new types of transport. That's super exciting. So this paper is about, obviously, electric scooters. Our motivation comes from this change that's happened. So there's been great advances in battery and electric motor technology, and that spurred this kind of nascent growth in the use of electric cars, which obviously is very positive for the environment. But is that really the cleverest thing you can do with all this new technology? Just keep the vehicle size the same and stick a new engine in it? If you actually look at car journeys, the vast majority of car journeys are under 3 kilometers, are actually quite short. And what you're doing if you're using electric cars, sure, you're maybe not using kind of petrol or fossil fuels, but you're still using a lot of energy to move that dead weight of the car around. And in fact, actually, electric cars are often heavier than existing petrol cars. So there's been kind of this new movement really to try and think about new types of vehicles that can enable new types of mobility. And this has been given the name micro-mobility. Of course, scooters, electric scooters, are the most perhaps obvious example of that. If you've been in any urban space in the last couple of years, you'll have seen this rapid adoption of hiring e-scooters in really cities all over the world. Now, we might focus a little bit on the rental of those scooters, and surely that's the one that's most obvious, but you can actually purchase them as well. And there's a lot of people who are actually buying the scooters as well and using them for their own personal transport. Together, these make for something that actually hasn't happened for a really long time in transport, which is the invention of a new type of mobility. There've been lots of attempts to do this over the years, but this is one of the first ones that's actually caught on, a new user interface for urban travel, and that's really quite exciting. My co-author, Sylvaine, she did observations in Paris at the end of October, at the end of April last. She did a bunch of interviews with e-scooter users, also shop owners of shops that were selling e-scooters. We also did an extensive review of the newspaper coverage and various analyst reports. Obviously, e-scooters have also been controversial because there's worries about them littering the urban space and the hazards that can cause. And also, Sylvaine made use of a method that's called the ride-along method, where she got people to rent scooters and wear actual cameras while they were doing that, while she rode behind them, also wearing a camera. So what do we get out of this? So the first thing I want to point out, and this is obviously something I go back to time and time again in my career, is the importance of enjoyment. There's just, if you've been on one of these e-scooters, let's be honest, it's just really fun, isn't it? This kind of not having to actually pedal, so it's very low effort, which I guess speaks to some of us. But also you can kind of thread your way through the urban environment, through pedestrians, through cars and the like. It's just very, very, very fun. More, perhaps a little bit more broadly than that, our participants talked about discovering the new parts of their city, that they would take different journeys and they would see the city from a different perspective. Perhaps as they're used to taking the underground or the metro, they would see the place they were actually traveling through overground, and this let them see the city in a new way. Now, I talked about this as kind of the two different ways in which you can use an e-scooter. You can rent it, of course. And there's these kind of many rental services like Bird and Lime. Now, interestingly, the renters that we spoke to were actually a little bit negative about the experience of renting. It was talked about as being non-reliable, that basically you couldn't really rely on a scooter being there, you couldn't find a scooter, even though it was on the app. And this meant that the use of it was, rather than being routine, it was more opportunistic. You know, you would kind of, oh, I've got this little journey I've got to do, and you saw a scooter and then you would take the opportunity to use it. Of course, the great thing about renting is it's a very low initial cost, and you can try out using an e-scooter just for a couple of euros. It's also possible to own an e-scooter and buy them. They're about $400, so maybe on the expensive side, but can be certainly very cheap compared to a car. But the interesting difference between the e-scooters that you buy and the e-scooters that you rent is that you can fold them down. And this might seem like a kind of trivial difference, but it's actually quite fundamental for how they can be used. Also, having your own scooter means that you can use it for commutes. It's a commutable transport technology, unlike the rental scooters, which aren't reliable enough to be used for that. Now, when you're actually on the road, when actually kind of we looked at the videos of people on the road with the scooters, we found something quite interesting, I think, a little bit about how users are treated by other road users and how they themselves drive themselves. There's this sort of hybrid status that e-scooters have, because it's not quite settled yet what they are and what we can expect of them on the road. In one way, they can be like a car. You can drive in the middle of the lane just like a car. In another, you can scoot around traffic like a bicycle does. Or even, and perhaps slightly controversially, you can go on the pavement and become a pedestrian. And there's this kind of hybrid state that I think that the e-scooters have that makes them very dynamic and flexible in dense urban spaces. Now, I talked a little about this kind of, that you can fold scooters up. And again, this is not a new thing for transport methods, but it does enable this new way of traversing the city. There's a quick story I always quite like, which is that if you saw a jar full of marbles and you were asked, is this jar full? You would probably say yes. But you could actually pour sand and the sand would go through the marbles. Or you could pour a glass of water into that jar and it would go in between the bits of sand. And this is a little bit like the scooter making its way through a dense city. It finds gaps in a very dense city. And one of our participants talked about hacking the city using the scooter. And so while a lot of the debate around e-scooter use has been about whether it substitutes for walking or it substitutes for driving, one thought of to be bad and one thought to be good, Actually, its use was a little bit more about finding whole new routes, maybe taking the bus for a little bit, taking the scooter for another bit, going on a urban train line for another. And this ease of folding meant that, unlike a folding bike, which can be quite cumbersome and complex to do that, folding can be done in a few seconds, and this makes it this very interesting intermodal technology. Intermodal has always been the kind of the dream of transport planners, and they've never really been able to pull it off. It's quite difficult to do. And this is, I think, just a really exciting technology to think about the potential for supporting that. Of course, I can't not mention the conflicts that that come out of e-scooters as well. And what's interesting, though, I think, and we go into a little bit more depth in this in the paper, of course, is to get data on this conflict. We actually looked at the interactions that were happening using our video cameras, interactions happening between pedestrians and e-scooter users, and we could see that there is this potential for conflict that goes on. There have also been worries a lot about the danger of e-scooters, and I have to say that none of the rental e-scooter participants that we talked to wore a helmet. And of course, also the jury's still a little bit out on the environmental costs of these e-scooters, and certainly the rental ones again. But I think, again, I come turn to this initial point here, that this is something new in an area that hasn't had much innovation for a long time, and we're seeing kind of new interactions in traffic that are, I think, really interesting for the HI community to look at. In fact, there's a paper there we've got coming out in Journal of Transport Geography that actually goes into a little bit more depth into some of those issues. The way we see it is that e-scooters are kind of version 1. And we really should be sort of seeing them as the end of the story, but the beginning. It's one of the first new successful non-car vehicles. And we think there's lots of exciting new opportunities for not only new service design, but also new vehicle design. We actually had a workshop that we were going to have on new mobilities at Kjærup. Unfortunately, we can't have it, but maybe we'll have it again next year to touch on a bunch of these issues. But I really think this is just an exciting story that perhaps is just getting started. So that's me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Lovely, lovely talk. So we have some questions. We'll start with Mako Leong. And if you could unshare your screen, Barry, so that we can see everyone. And then if everyone clicks on the gallery view, then we can see more of you guys. So Mako Leong, I think you're on. I think you've been unmuted. Please ask your question. Can't hear you. You need to speak up or take off the headset or something. Mako?
Okay, I think unfortunately Mako might not be a real person.
Yes, he is there, and I can see the video. But okay, we'll move on to let's see. The next one is Stine Lundgaard. Stine, let's see if we can find you and unmute you. There you are. There you go. Please ask your question.
Thank you for the very interesting talk and very interesting session as well. So in this coronavirus period, I've been binge watching Ally McBeal, and there was this episode where she's she's driving down the pavement on an e-scooter. Actually, this was in the late 90s, which I thought was interesting because now I've been seeing all these studies about e-scooters as a new thing, and then here I was watching this old TV show, but it made me think that she's a lawyer, she's using it for work, and mostly I've been seeing these e-scooters used by teenagers, mostly people who are too young to even be allowed to drive them through the city. I was wondering if you have done if any part of your study also included looking into different kinds of users for these e-scooters, or if you have any insights about different purposes that they're being used for. Did you include anything like that? You have 25 interviews. Were these all pretty homogeneous, or yeah? I hope that's clear.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, Sylvaine can talk to the interviews. But just to say, yeah, this is a thing that's kind of come up, and I think, you know, the scooters are really enjoyable to travel around on, and kids are actually excluded from so much in the city, and they get very bored, as we've seen with some of the trolling here, you know, and I've got a little bit of sympathy, even though, you know, it can be difficult sometimes because they are excluded in lots of ways. And I know, you know, it's like the kids aren't meant to use these scooters because of their age, but I think sometimes we have a little bit of sympathy for them, you know, they're not having much to do. But I think it just talks to the kind of playful, enjoyable aspect of riding these scooters, doesn't it?
So Barry, the question from Mako, who couldn't get his microphone to work, was he was asking whether the vehicles are subsidized.
So they're not, but I guess they actually in a roundabout way are, because all these firms lose lots of money. So it's a kind of long-term question about whether they're actually can make enough money to survive. I think probably they can, because they've just been using these kind of off-the-shelf scooters, and I think they're developing scooters that have, you know, last for a lot longer and have replaceable batteries and such like. So maybe not all of them will survive though. But there is an interesting thing there about the public-private interaction around the scooter use, which is again, there are private companies that are using them, but much public transport is kind of state provided. So there's some interesting areas there for that interaction. Maybe create new services around that.
So the next question is from Lars-Erik.
Hello there. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I could add that here in UK, they're not allowed. So we don't have any. You can't even buy them yourself because the regulatory framework hasn't been developed. But I actually follow up on Mako's question, because I think they're not only subsidized, they're extremely heavily subsidized. These companies are losing insane amounts of money at the moment. And I think your study also pointed to a couple of things that make them, I love the idea. I want to have an e-scooter infrastructure, but it seems that it's at present it's not sustainable. One of the things you pointed out was that you can't actually rely on them because they may not be there when you actually need them. So then you think about, okay, do I buy my own? $400 is not that much, but they get stolen or they get vandalized all the time. For some reason, they seem to be more vulnerable than bikes, maybe because they look more expensive, I don't know. So my question is really, can you continue answering the last question, which is, how can this excellent opportunity actually become commercially viable? Because right now it's the cost and the benefit just doesn't add up.
Well, the thing with transport, which is so interesting, is that everything in transport is subsidized. Like the cost of roads is never really met by the road users. The space that they take up, you know, your parking spaces that you pay a little bit of money for would actually be worth huge amounts more if they were, you know, used for other things. So, and similarly for urban transport, like, you know, metros and the like. So it's a funny area actually, and actually to talk a little bit about subsidy there, which is that it's kind of competing against a bunch of services that are themselves already getting subsidized quite heavily. So it's not the case of like, oh, the fact it's being subsidized means it's not sustainable, because, you know, most transport in, you know, full stop is subsidized, and it is sustainable in some way, maybe not in others. So yeah, I think this is kind of, it's a complex. I don't have a good answer to your question, because I think you hit on exactly this point, that there's this great opportunity, but clearly it's not quite there yet. But of course, that, you know, that's nice for us researchers usually, isn't it?
Well, the whole circular economy question about the work is really hard to answer, isn't it? Because it's, if you look at all the costs or not, and what is transport, and should we be socializing and traveling anywhere? Anyway, we have one more question from Kjærup. Kjærup, let's see if you can unmute yourself. Yes, there you are. Go for it.
Hi. So this was an impressive data collection. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how data was collected and what were the challenges of doing that in such a dynamic environment. And of course, I'm referring to the following of the drivers.
I think Sylvaine, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, hi, Kjærup. Thank you very much for the question. It was about being out in the street for 5 weeks and just having the material ready. And then so I started with just going to people and interviewing, asking them for interviews. And then after one interview, two, and trying to make build some form of trust, and then asking them if I could video record them, having the equipment, the video equipment ready. There were some failures, some recordings I didn't get, etc. But in the end, we ended up with enough material to do that. But yeah, it takes some just going for it and accepting some failures, and trying again. But
yeah, I think we'll have a coffee and talk about it. Thank you.
That's a great question. Actually, I think we have to stop now.
Yeah, can I